We know that these drugs, by and large, right, that marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, that these are essentially global commodities. And they exist in global commodity markets the same way that coffee and tea and sugar and alcohol and tobacco and precious metals and other food products exist, right? Where there is a demand, there will be a supply, right? And when people say, let's cut off the supply, the number of people in the government say we've got to focus on cutting off the supply, and every economist in the world goes, what are you, crazy? If there's a demand, there will be a supply. If you crack down in one country, it's going to pop up in another place. If you pay the peasants here to grow something else, the peasants there will start growing this stuff. Where there is a demand, there will be a supply. If one country's coffee production gets knocked out, you know what happens? Another country starts growing more and selling more. These are global commodities markets. Ultimately, the way to deal with global commodities markets is not to prohibit them, because if that's not going to work, the answer is to regulate them. The notion of putting a police agency in the business of regulating a global commodities market is an absurdity. But that's been the policy for the last century, and it's only now with marijuana that we're just beginning to work our way out of that. Right? So the consequence of the crime, violence, corruption, black markets that look, it happens in our country as well. But the magnitude of Colombia had this horrible problem 25 years ago. They were able to get a handle on it. You know how mostly they got a handle on it? They pushed it over to Mexico. You know Mexico's big problem? Mexico's got no place to push it because they're right next door to us. Sometimes they can push it down in Central America a bit, but that doesn't work, or over the Caribbean a bit. But those countries will just be swamped by this stuff as well. All we're doing is pushing the shit around while the other shit is flowing over this way. Excuse my French. The second major negative consequence is that by choosing to deal with these drug problems as criminal matters rather than health matters, you're all familiar with HIV and AIDS, the way it spread both with gay sex, right, and with heterosexual sex in Africa. But the other major way it spread is with people who inject drugs, right, then sharing the needle that they use or maybe having sexual relations. And that, in America, we probably lost 100 to 200,000 people in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s because of our decision not to treat that as a health issue. Countries like Australia and European countries that treated HIV and drug use as health issues had HIV rates among their drug users of under 5%. In America, many cities and states had HIV rates of 50% among their injecting drug users. That if you look at in which area has the drug war killed the most people, it's in this area. It's in HIV, AIDS, and now hepatitis. It's the refusal to deal with these as health issues, the determination to treat anybody who injects a drug without a prescription as a criminal. Right? That's the second thing. It's been a devastating consequence in parts of Asia, in parts of the former Soviet Union, and it's hit the United States in a big way as well. And the third major negative consequence is really here in the US. You probably know some of these numbers, right? United States, we are less than 5% of the world's population, but we are almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Less than 5% of the world's population, 300 million plus out of 6.5, 7 billion total, and 2.3 million people behind bars today out of a total of, maybe a little under 10 million worldwide. We rank first in the world when it comes to incarcerating our fellow citizens. Our rates of incarceration are 4, 5, 6, 7 times the rates of incarceration in major parts of Western Europe, Australia, Canada, even though their rates of illegal drug use are not that much different than ours, and even though the rates of most sorts of crime are not that different than ours, and even though their ethnic, racial background, remember, Europe's no longer a white place anymore. It's becoming as racially, ethnically diverse as the United States is. Right? It's basically, but we're locking up people for faster and longer and everything. Right? And I'll tell you something else. Now, Russia is in second place, huffing and puffing to catch up with us. We've left them in the dust when it comes up to mass incarceration. We have the highest rate of incarceration, not only of any society in the world today, we have the highest incarceration rate of any democratic society in history. Right? China's got 5 times as many people as we do. It's got fewer people behind bars. China, right? And this is not consistent, moreover. It's not like America's always been this way. This has just happened the last 40 years. It was like we went on this national orgy of incarcerating people. And if you ask, how was that possible? I'll tell you two things. One is the drug war. The demonization of people for possessing, using, selling, buying, growing this stuff. The demonization meant we started to treat people and values in non-violent activities, typically with no harm to others, no theft, violence, crime. We started to treat them the same as rapists and murderers, and to put them in prison behind bars for 10, 20, 30 years, lifetime, in a way that was grossly disproportionate to the rest of the civilized world. The other part of this is the element of race. I don't know, how many of you have heard of the book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow? Any of you raise your hand. Take a look at it. It's a fantastic book about the role that race and racism has played in the drug war in this country. Here's what we know. Black people are maybe 14% of the population, but they're like 50% of the people behind bars. 1 in 3 black men is going to spend some time behind bars during their life the way we're going today. And that for Latinos, it's not as severe as it is with African Americans, but it's not the same. It's much more significant, much more targeted in that group as well than it is with non-Latino white people in this country, right? Let me put it this way. If the large majority of people being arrested or using these drugs were white people, no way would we have the incarceration rates we have today. No way. No way. You all know what Jim Crow was, right? Jim Crow were the racist laws that kept black people down in the South, you know, from the late 19th century until the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? I mean, sort of overt racist laws. And what many people argue, and the evidence is there, is that the war on drugs emerged as a more discreet way to perpetuate the same sorts of policies. The evidence shows that black people and white people and brown people basically use drugs at roughly the same rates, right? We know, just with marijuana, that if you randomly stop 100 black kids, 100 brown kids, 100 white kids in almost any neighborhood in America, and you look in their pockets, roughly the same percent are going to have a little weed in their pocket. But in every city in America, the black kids are 2, 3, 5, 10 times more likely to be arrested and processed through the criminal justice system than are the white kids, and the Latino kids someplace in the middle, right? That's just not fair. Same likelihood of having a little weed in your pocket, but that person, because of their skin color, right, is going to land up being the one who gets busted more often. Why? Well, in part, if you're in poor black neighborhoods, you got lots more cops there always looking to keep, blah, blah. Or if you got a black kid in a white neighborhood, the white cops got their eyes on why is that black kid doing in the white neighborhood. Either way, they're screwed, right? That element of race in this thing, the notion that when you see pictures of prisons in many parts of America, when it's overwhelmingly dark-skinned faces, that there's that level. For many white people, it's the level not of overt racism, but of almost subconscious racism, where it's like, those people, not my people, those people. And the fact that we're all, or most of us are Americans, the fact we're all human beings, we all have mothers and fathers, we have kids, right? That becomes secondary. We're able to demonize the other in that way. So when you look at the rate of incarceration of black people in this country, it grossly exceeds the rate of incarceration not only of apartheid South Africa, but of the Soviet gulags of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, which had the highest rates of incarceration, in modern history. Right? I mean, understand the element in which these laws, from their origins to the ways that they're enforced today, have been driven by, justified by, about race and racism, both conscious and deliberate, and oftentimes unconscious, undeliberate, but manifesting in that way. It's part of the illegitimacy of this whole thing. Okay? So that's the monstrosity we're dealing with. And when you go to jail or prison, it's not just the time you spend there. It's when you come out and you're a second or third class citizen for the rest of your life. In some places, you'll never be able to vote again. In many places, you won't be able to get a license. You won't be able to teach. You won't be able to work with kids. You won't be able to do this or that or that or this. I mean, we also have that whole system. And it's not just incarceration, because not only do we have 2.3 million people behind bars tonight, we got another 5.5 million people under the supervision of the parole and probation system, right? Being watched, being forced to piss into a bottle to show you haven't smoked a joint or done some other drug, against the rules. Being told by some, parole probation officer, if you don't do this, we're going to bust your ass. We're going to lock you up again, right? State of California, I don't know if it's still true, but it was true until a couple years ago, over half the people going to your California state prisons were not going because they committed a new crime. They were going simply for a low-level violation of their parole and probation. Right? This is the system. When you go to sleep at night, just think about it. Around this state, you've got prisons all over the place. And now it's beginning to come down a bit, but not fast enough, not enough. You know, from my perspective, I think what our objective needs to be on this is to make America average. To reduce our prison rate so that our rate is at the global average, the same way it was 40 and 50 and 60 years ago and throughout most of our history. But that would essentially require us reducing the prison population by 70 or 80%. Now, interestingly, the evidence is showing that if you look at the states which have been reducing the prison population most rapidly in the last 5 or 10 years, those also happen to be the states where crime is coming down the fastest. It's not a perfect lineup, but what it shows is that the notion that we need to lock up more people to stay safer turns out to be backwards. It turns out that sending more and more people to prison, where they land up, which are essentially schools for criminals, and where your networks become the people you know in prison, and where when you come out it's hard to get a job because nobody wants to hire somebody who's been in prison, that it actually creates a self-perpetuating prophecy on this sort of stuff. We know what is the number one predictor that a young person will land up spending time behind bars? Is it IQ, race, education? You know what it is? Whether or not you had a parent who spent time behind bars. We're not exactly sure what's the causal relationship, but having a parent who spent time behind bars is the number one predictor that a child will end up spending time behind bars. We have to reverse this cycle of the circle. My job, the job of I'm very proud. I built the biggest organization in the world, Drug Policy Alliance, trying to end the drug war, right? And what we're trying to do is to roll it all back, right? You know, if you imagine, well, it's not about legalizing all drugs, but it's also not just about more treatment and education. It's something less than full legalization and more than that. The way to think about it is, imagine you have a choice of drug policies, from the most draconian at one end to the most libertarian free market at the other end. Over here you got Saudi Arabia, Singapore, you cut off their hands, you whip them, you throw them into treatment prison camps, you execute them for selling an ounce of marijuana or a gram of heroin, whatever. And then all the way down to the other end where you have the free market policy. Right? Think about a cigarette policy in America 50 years ago. Low tax, no controls, except maybe a little bit with kids. Right? And what we're trying to do is to move drug policy down the spectrum from the highly punitive to the less punitive, from treating as a criminal justice issue to treating as a health issue, to moving in the area of sensible regulations. If I'm going to summarize it in one sentence, it's a long sentence, but one sentence, what we're trying to do is to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control as much as possible while still protecting safety and health. Trying to reduce the role of criminalization, by which I mean the criminal law, and the role of the criminal justice system, cops, prosecutors, prison, all that, trying to reduce the role of criminalization in the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent possible while still protecting safety and health. It means stopping short on decriminalization or legalization at the point at which we risk a dramatic risk to safety and health. Right? The group of this growing drug policy reform movement ranges from the people who are libertarian legalizers, whether they're left-wing civil libertarian legalizers or right-wing property rights legalizers, to the people over here who aren't sure they want to legalize anything, maybe even marijuana, but who believe we got to reduce the prison population, treat drug use and addiction as health issues, and what have you. I will know that I've succeeded in my life's cause when the public debate is no longer about drug war versus drug reform, but where the debates between what I would call the legalizers and the public health decriminalizers, the debates within my world, become the national and the global debates. Okay. Here's what reform consists of. First of all, end marijuana prohibition. End it. Tax the damn stuff, regulate it, treat it more or less like alcohol, right? 4 states, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, and Oregon, all did that with votes of 55% of the electorate. You guys are going to get a vote on that next year. I and my colleagues are in the midst of helping draft a law, which you will probably get to vote on a year from now. 4 or 5 other states are going to vote on it next year. One state, Ohio, is going to vote on it in a few weeks. Right? You know, if you look at public opinion, look at the public opinion on gay marriage and public opinion on marijuana legalization, over like Gallup poll over the last 10 years, they line up almost exactly. Back 12 years ago, 11 years ago, a third of Americans favored gay marriage and favored legalizing marijuana. Now, 53, 54% favor both of those things, right? We're moving in that direction. It's not a given. There's going to be bumps along the way. I and my colleagues, we never saw that edibles, marijuana edibles, it's going to become such a huge thing. And you know, edibles take too much. It's not a pleasant experience. Fortunately, it's not dangerous either. It's not going to kill you. Nice thing about weed is weed can't kill you. And you can combine weed with any other drug, and it may make you sick or tired or nauseous or whatever, dizzy, but it's not going to kill you, right? So that's the first thing. We got to end marijuana. Half of the drug arrests in America are still for marijuana, right? And California's come a long way in decriminalizing it, but we just got to make this thing orderly, right? And one little bonus on all this stuff is when I talk to my allies in Mexico, and I say, when you guys are going to start getting a debate going? They say the only thing they'll really get the debate going in Mexico is for California to legalize marijuana. Because at that point, in Mexico, why are we spending all this time and energy trying to keep marijuana from being grown for the American market when California is actually regulating and taxing it and getting tax revenue? That's first. The second thing is we got to keep the prison population coming down. Here in California, you guys, I hope some of you voted for them, you had a ballot initiative 3 years ago, Prop 36, to reform the 3 strikes law. Smart law. It's helped reduce the prison population. Last year, you had another one, Prop 47, which basically said, stop putting people in prison for low-level offenses, provide alternatives, etc. That, too, has brought down the prison population as well. There's also been some judicial orders and other things bringing it all down. You're moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, what your governor is doing is for every 3 people he takes out of a state prison, he puts an extra 2 in a local jail. So it's kind of like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but there's some progress. Hold on a second. Okay, yeah. So there's a whole host of things going on, but what it basically means is, prisons are for people who are really a threat. Rapists, murderers, people who steal, people who really do bad stuff. But we have to reassess why we think people who use or possess drugs, or even people who just sell to other adults, why we need to treat them as criminals. And the third thing is, we got to be serious about treating drug use and addiction as a health issue. We know how bad alcohol and tobacco are, but we're not turning people into criminals if they keep using or even if they're addicted. They have to do something bad. And that's the way it should be with the other drugs as well. If you use cocaine, you use heroin, use pharmaceuticals off the books, use methamphetamine, if you're not hurting anybody else, right, you don't need to be in jail. Other countries have changed their laws and policies saying we're not putting anybody in jail for simple drug use or possession. Portugal is a great example. If you're really a bad guy, we'll catch you for something else. But we want to spend our money on trying to help people, give them opportunities, deal with their drug addiction as a health issue or a mental illness issue, instead of putting them in jail and giving all the money to the cops in the prisons, right? It means, more people died last year of an overdose than died in an auto accident. Accidental overdose is the #1 cause of accidental death in America now over auto accidents. What does it mostly involve? It's actually not that you took too much of heroin or something. It's typically that people combined either heroin or a pharmaceutical opiate, a pain drug, with booze. Combining these drugs, pain-killing drugs with booze, if you do it at a low level, it can feel really nice. The problem is, if you do a little too much of it, it can stop your breathing. Most overdoses are actually fatal drug combinations. There's an antidote called naloxone that should be available everywhere. CVS just agreed to start selling it over the counter. We've changed the laws. You know, it's about calling 911. We're passing 911 Good Samaritan laws. So if a buddy overdoses, you can call 911 without risk of getting arrested, right? But we need to reduce the number of people getting hurt by drugs and getting hurt by the drug war. What it all comes down to is this. There has more or less never been a drug-free society. In the history of human civilization, there has barely ever been a drug-free society. Virtually every society has discovered, has planted, has devised, has uncovered different substances with which to alter our consciousness, whether to deal with pain or to make yourself feel good or for religious purposes, whatever, right? All around the world, you know, primitive tribes who knew nothing about anything, right, figured out that that stuff could make good booze. Right? And all around the world, people figured out that if you ate that funny-looking mushroom or fungi, well, that would kill you. Eat that one, you see God. Right? All around the world. Now, it is true, we can all alter our consciousness without ever using drugs. But what's remarkable is the universality with which people have relied on psychoactive substances to alter our consciousness for pleasure, to deal with pain in destructive ways and productive ways and all of this sort of stuff. That's the fact of the matter. We are not moving into a world where your children or grandchildren will have fewer psychoactive drugs. There will be more of them. There will be ecstasy generation 7 and Viagra generation 18 and combinations of all these things, right? All of this stuff is in the future. There is no way to solve this on the supply side of the law enforcement side. Ultimately, what it all boils down to is accepting the fact that drugs are here to stay. Accepting that we cannot build a moat around our children or ourselves to keep drugs at bay. It's accepting that we have no choice but to accept this and to learn how to live with drugs so that they cause the least possible harm and in some cases the greatest possible benefit. Drugs are here to stay, so are we. We have to learn how to live with them so they cause the least possible harm and in some cases the greatest possible benefit. The cops and the prisons should stay at the edges of this policy. Common sense, rationality, compassion, respect for one another at the forefront. Thank you.